Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Garfield, and the focus is principal and politician. The year is 1856, and Garfield has just graduated with honors from the prestigious college, Williams College on the East Coast in Massachusetts, and now he had a decision to make. What was he going to do for a career? And it basically came down to two options: preacher or teacher. He could see himself as doing either. He eventually went with the latter. He was going to pursue that academic world, and he had some options, and he decided to take the least lucrative offer on the table, and that was to go back home to Hiram, the eclectic institute that had been rebranded now as Hiram College. It was an opportunity to be a full-time teacher there and to come home, including his relationship with Lucretia Rudolph, who had continued to see much through correspondence while he was away at Williams, even though the relationship, frankly, was very strained. It was not giving him everything that he was really looking for. Garfield said that she had not that natural warmth of heart which my nature calls so loudly for. In fact, at one point while he was at Williams, he almost called the whole thing off. And Lucretia actually decided to break down and confide in him and let him see what she had been writing in her diary. And this made a big impact on Garfield, who said, "Never before did I see such depths of suffering and such entire devotion of heart as was displayed in her private journal, which she allowed me to read. It gave him enough confidence to continue to pursue that relationship along with his new job." For that, he did what he always did. He poured himself into work, 6 classes, 5 days a week. He had reunited also with his friend Almeda Booth, and they were very much the academic leaders on campus. He also became an ordained minister, and he would preach to local churches on Sundays. Also had a bit of a political awareness coming out as well for Garfield, who was very much against slavery. He was not quite an abolitionist, which was still very uncommon in the North, but he was leaning in that direction. He had a lot of focus on what was happening in Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had passed, which had turned violent, and now bleeding Kansas was going on, with this idea of the Northerners coming, the Southerners coming, all trying to establish either a pro or anti-slavery government in the territory of Kansas. Well, political parties were also going through some changes. The Whigs had kind of fallen away. Some new parties had cropped up to take on the National Party of the Democrats. And Garfield was aligned with the new Republican Party, principally over the one topic, which was core to their political beliefs: no more expansion of slavery, and that definitely appealed to James Garfield. There was another change that was going on right there at Hiram College as the trustees decided to oust the principal, Amos Hayden. They wanted to make a change, and there were two options and two very strong camps on Hiram as to which one should go forward. There was the most seasoned of the professors, Norman Dunshee, and the newest, James Garfield. Which way were the trustees going to go? There was a lot of political fighting on this, and eventually they went to the future. They gave it to the younger one, James Garfield, and he accepted that position, but he knew it would be a rough transition. He said, "A score are looking on with vulture eyes and longing for me to fail, and I am resolved that they shall not be gratified. If work and nerve and backbone can avail anything," these are the things he had always relied upon. There was a lot more work because he still had to do all his teaching on top of being the principal, but he was never shy of being the hardest worker in the room. One of his biggest decisions he had to make again was about his relationship with Lucretia Rudolph, who they called Crete. He had decided to eventually figure out, am I going to marry her or not, as he had kind of been dithering on this decision. And eventually, even after he was conflicted, he kind of felt a sense of duty. They had been together a long time. He eventually popped the question. She agreed, and they married November the 11th of 1858. 3 days before his 27th birthday. Now, there was no honeymoon. They went straight back to work because he had a big opportunity ahead of him. William Denton was an English orator who was coming to the United States to hold a bunch of debates. The topic was evolution. Now, Charles Darwin actually wouldn't come out with his Origin of the Species treatise for another year, but it was around this time that this topic of evolution was certainly being discussed, being debated, and James Garfield, on the other side of the equation, was ready to go and embrace this debate with William Denton. This was a big moment. He spent every day, day and night with Almeda Booth preparing over and over again. It was a multi-day debate at the end of December of 1858, and it ended up being a grand triumph for James Garfield, who said that on the whole, it was by far the most momentous occasion of my life. For none was I ever better prepared, and on none did I ever succeed better. And it had a big impact. It was a catalytic moment in his life because outsiders, not just his inner circle, outsiders started to pay attention to James Garfield, and there was a political opening. Cyrus Prentiss, the local representative of the state legislature, had recently died, and so there was now an opening, and some were saying James Garfield should make the run as the Republican candidate. Well, Garfield always has said when these political issues came up, and he would say this really for the rest of his political career, that he was very sensitive to being seen as doing something for his own personal gain, so he wasn't going to pursue this nomination. But he told his friends, if you want to nominate me, I'll be happy to make the race. That's what they did. He got the Republican nomination. He went up against the Democrat Alva Hill, and he won that race easily, off to the State House for James Garfield. Now, that was a part-time job, as he was still the full-time professor and principal at Hiram. But at 28, he went to the State House in Columbus, the youngest member of that state legislature. That had never really stopped him, as he engaged straight into the debate. He was not going to sit in the back and sort of wait his turn. And he spoke pretty aggressively on an early topic. There was a proposal to cut funding for education in the state. And obviously, education had been the core to his rise from that one-room log cabin to now his place of prominence in a political role. And he fought this. Now, he didn't win this fight politically, but he got a lot of people to take notice. This was someone that people should pay attention to. He started making some political connections. The outgoing governor, Salmon, became a confidant, as did the new governor, William Dennison. Now, on the national scene, there was increasingly concern about, again, what was going on in Kansas as that violence began to spread. And James Garfield was hardly an innocent bystander to this. He was paying a lot of attention because one of his own constituents was at the center of this, a man by the name of John Brown. Brown had committed some violent acts on the anti-slavery front in Kansas, and now he led a group to try to initiate a slave revolt in Virginia, in Harper's Ferry. They sought to take over the federal arsenal there, get some guns, lead the slave revolt. Maybe it would expand. Well, it didn't go that way. He was caught. He was hanged. Garfield, sympathetic for at least the nature and cause that John Brown was fighting for. He said, I do not justify his acts, by no means, but I do accord to him and think every man must honesty of purpose and sincerity of heart. This was an important element for where James Garfield was going and thinking politically, but he was still being brought back to his home. He was not happy. His connection with his new bride was weak. He longed for more. And in fact, he wrote a letter to his wife that said that he believed their marriage to be a great mistake. He called these his dark years that were spent in a sadness almost bordering on despair. What did he do? He poured himself into work. They did have a daughter, which helped. He named her Eliza after his own mother, but they always called her Trot, out of the character from David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. And Trot was a nice, welcome addition to the family, but again, his eyes and ears and work was primarily elsewhere, especially as the country was clearly falling apart. The fracture was apparently going to come because that election of 1860 was on the horizon and the Democrats were sorely fractured. They could not unify in a single candidate. That meant the opening for the Republicans, which Garfield was thrilled for. He was happy to give a July 4th address for the candidate, Abraham Lincoln, when he talked not only pro-union and anti-slavery, even if this meant, which could mean, secession and war. They were very much aware of this. And sure enough, after Lincoln was elected, South Carolina led the way out of the Union, calling for its own secession. 6 states followed. The nation is fracturing at the seams. President James Buchanan was doing very little to stop it. What about Abraham Lincoln, the president-elect? Well, he was staying basically silent. He started to break that silence when he took the train ride from Springfield, Illinois, his home, to Washington, D.C., and he made a bunch of stops along the way, including one of the early ones was in Columbus, Ohio, where he spoke to the state legislature, and James Garfield was there. He was really impressed with Lincoln. He said there is no touch of affectation in him. He is frank, direct, and thoroughly honest. His remarkable good sense, simple and condensed style of expression, and evident marks of indomitable will give me great hopes for the country. Garfield would later doubt Lincoln in his role as commander-in-chief in terms of his overall strategy and effectiveness, but for now he was optimistic. And Garfield was very much aligned for this cause. Preserve the Union and increasingly that abolitionist take, preserve the Union, and free the slaves. James Garfield said, "I am inclined to believe that the sin of slavery is one of which it may be said that without the shedding of blood there is no remission. All that is left for us is to arm and prepare to defend ourselves and the federal government." He was fully ready to go do that, and they all knew what was coming. The eyes were all focused on Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, which was the last fort that federal troops still existed in the seceded states. And this clash was coming. When Abraham Lincoln, now president, had taken his oath, he decided to re-provision that fort, which was running out of provisions. The Confederates said no. They opened up a bombardment on Fort Sumter there in Charleston Harbor, and on April 12th of 1861, the Civil War began. President Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. James Garfield was ready to go. He had actually spent the last couple of years, if he wasn't busy enough, actually studying the law. He had just passed the bar in 1861, but there was no time to practice law for him. He had another calling. James Garfield was going to war, and that's the story for another day. That is James Garfield, and principal and politician from the life of James Garfield. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.